They say every story has two sides. But what if I told you the Amityville Horror has countless sides, hidden, obscured, deliberately forgotten? That realization didn't creep into my mind like a slow-burning revelation. It struck all at once, delivered by a single unassuming envelope left on my doorstep. The envelope felt rough, its coarse, yellowing paper betraying its age. I held it tightly, my breath shallow and measured, as if exhaling too hard might destroy its fragile secrets. My fingers trembled as I slid the envelope open, the sound of tearing paper sharp and deliberate in the heavy silence around me. Inside, a single sheet bore a cryptic message in jagged black ink: "What you've heard is only half the truth." Those words burrowed deep like thorns pressing against raw skin. They demanded more than attention, they demanded action. I turned the letter over, searching for context or meaning, but it offered nothing more. No signature, no return address, just those haunting words: confusion, fear, compulsion. They crashed over me in waves, each stronger than the last. Who sent this? Why me? And perhaps most unsettling, why now? The questions spiraled, their weight pulling me under. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the words etched themselves into my mind. Sleep became a distant memory, and by morning I was resolute. I had to know the truth. Ignoring it wasn't an option, not for someone like me. For most, Amityville is just a ghost story, a grotesque piece of pop culture. But for me, it's personal. My connection to it isn't casual curiosity, it's a festering wound. A failed story from years ago, one that cost me more than credibility, had tethered me to the town and its darkness. This wasn't just about uncovering secrets, it was about redemption. In November 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. shocked the nation by methodically murdering his family, 6 people, all in their beds. A year later, the Lutz family moved into the same house and fled within 28 days, claiming the place was cursed, alive with malevolence. What followed were decades of books, movies, and debates over hoax or horror. But that letter, that damned letter, suggested a deeper truth, a darker one. As sunlight broke over my cluttered desk, it felt wrong. Too bright, too revealing. Even my dog sensed it, pacing near the door with her tail tucked low, soft whines breaking the oppressive quiet. Outside, the world seemed altered. Trees swayed violently in still air, and the shadows they cast stretched unnaturally long. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating, alive. Yet I pushed forward. This wasn't about fear, it was about truth. And the truth waited for me at 112 Ocean Avenue. My obsession grew fast, an ember fanned into flames. I packed my bag mechanically, my mind spiraling through fragments of what I knew, or thought I knew. My reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed different, my own eyes unrecognizable, hollow. In the days that followed, the unease lingered, feeding on my resolve. Shadows in my apartment felt heavier, darker. Objects shifted imperceptibly, though I hadn't touched them. The air felt deliberate, like the silence wasn't absence, but presence. Once, as I sat at my desk, a faint vibration ran through the floor, rhythmic and unrelenting. I froze, my pulse hammering, but it stopped the moment I acknowledged it. My dog's behavior worsened. She avoided me, her eyes darting toward invisible threats in the corners of the room. But the pull of the letter was stronger than fear. It wasn't just a story I was chasing anymore. The story was chasing me. By the time I finally stood at the edge of my driveway, car keys in hand, the air felt electric, thick with anticipation. The journey ahead wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Amityville wasn't just a ghost story or a tragic crime scene. It was something far older, far darker. I didn't know it then, but the truth I sought wouldn't just change my understanding of the house. It would change me, forever. Every investigation begins with facts, or at least the illusion of them. My first step was the records, police reports, trial transcripts, and the relentless churn of media coverage surrounding the DeFeo murders. The facts seemed straightforward. 6 lives taken in a single night by Ronald DeFeo Jr., the eldest son using a Marlin .35 rifle. But the deeper I dug, the more the cracks began to show. The rifle was deafening, a weapon that should have shattered the night with every shot. Yet neighbors reported hearing nothing. No screams, no gunfire, only silence. Even the victims themselves remained in their beds undisturbed, as though something unseen held them in place. Ronald's confession, unnervingly calm, painted a picture of detached violence, but inconsistencies riddled his account. His timeline wavered. His motives shifted like shadows, never settling on a single truth. Each document I read only deepened my unease, a growing awareness that the murders were just the surface of something far darker. As I buried myself in the details, the world around me seemed to shift. It began with vibrations underfoot, faint and rhythmic, like a heartbeat emanating from the ground itself. Objects on my desk moved slightly, their positions just off from where I'd left them. At first, I told myself it was exhaustion, a trick of the mind. But the disturbances persisted, subtle yet undeniable. My dog's behavior worsened, her once calm demeanor replaced by nervous pacing and soft, plaintive whines directed at empty corners of the room. Still, I pressed on. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that the official story was a smokescreen. The house wasn't just a crime scene. It was a question no one dared to ask. The first real break came not from police files, but from an old library tucked away on the outskirts of town. Its shelves groaned under the weight of forgotten books, their spines cracked and worn. The librarian, an elderly man with tired eyes, hesitated when I mentioned Amityville. His gaze lingered on me, assessing, before he finally nodded and motioned for me to follow. The back room was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of aged paper and dust. He retrieved a book from the highest shelf, its cover faded and its pages yellowed. "This might help," he said quietly, as though speaking any louder would summon something unwelcome. The book was a collection of local legends, most of them mundane, until I reached the chapter titled The Mouth of the Beast. The stories spoke of a cursed land, a place where the very earth rejected life. According to the legends, the ground was a doorway, a living thing that fed on fear and pain. It described rituals and sacrifices performed to appease the malevolent force lurking beneath. The map at the end of the chapter was crude but unmistakable. At its center was an X, marked with trembling handwriting, 12 Ocean Avenue. The connection was undeniable, and with it came a weight I couldn't shake. The house wasn't just built on cursed land, it was the heart of something far older and far more dangerous. My next step was to find those who had lived in the shadow of the house. The first was an elderly woman who had spent her entire life in Amityville. Her home was a time capsule, filled with faded photographs and lace curtains that hadn't been moved in decades. When I mentioned the house, her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. "It's not the house," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's the ground. That's where the evil lives." Her words lingered long after I left, a warning that felt less like speculation and more like truth. The second encounter was less expected. As I stood outside the house one evening, lost in thought, a man approached me. His weathered face was lined with years of hardship, and his voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "You shouldn't be here," he said. When I asked why, his eyes flicked to the house and back to me. "It's awake now." Before I could press him further, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness as though he'd never been there at all. By this point, the boundaries between the investigation and my life had blurred. The shadows in my apartment no longer stayed confined to the corners. They moved now, deliberate and fluid, stretching across the walls like living things. My reflection in the mirror seemed wrong, the eyes staring back at me hollow and unfamiliar. The house's reach extended far beyond its walls, its influence seeping into every aspect of my life. Yet I couldn't stop. The truth was out there, tangled in layers of history and fear, and I was determined to unravel it. But the closer I got, the more I realized the house wasn't just waiting for me. It was watching me. The house loomed before me, its once pristine facade reduced to a lifeless shell. Paint peeled away in long, jagged strips, revealing the weathered wood beneath. The windows, clouded with grime, stared back like hollow eyes, indifferent to my presence. The air felt wrong, thick and oppressive, pressing against my chest with an almost physical weight. As I stepped closer, the faint metallic tang of rust lingered in the back of my throat, mingling with the faint, sour scent of decay. The front door resisted me at first, the warped wood groaning as though reluctant to open. The moment I crossed the threshold, the atmosphere changed. Inside, the air was colder, sharper, as though the house had been sealed off from time itself. The silence wasn't natural. It was dense, deliberate, wrapping itself around me and muffling even the sound of my own breathing. The hallway stretched out before me, narrow and dim, the faded wallpaper curling away from the walls like old skin. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by the faint shuffle of my footsteps. I moved toward the living room, drawn by a feeling I couldn't quite explain, a pull, insistent and unrelenting. The furniture in the living room stood like forgotten relics, draped in sheets that had yellowed with age. I approached the mirror on the far wall, its surface streaked with grime. At first, it reflected only the room behind me, a distorted echo of the decaying space. But as I leaned closer, something shifted. My reflection moved, not in sync with me, but a fraction of a second too late. Its face, my face, seemed subtly altered. The features were sharper, the eyes darker, and the faintest hint of a smile curled at the edges of its mouth. I stepped back quickly, the cold from the mirror seeping into my skin. In the kitchen, the air grew colder still. The floor tiles were slick with grime, their once bright patterns obscured by years of neglect. But one corner of the room stood out, unnervingly clean, as though someone had scrubbed it with obsessive precision. The sink was filled with dishes, encrusted with dirt and something darker that I refused to examine too closely. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but the pull, the insistent, unshakable pull, drew me onward. The stairs leading to the second floor groaned under my weight, each step reverberating like a warning. The hallway above felt narrower than it should have, the walls pressing in on either side. At the far end, I saw her. A small figure, her back turned to me, standing perfectly still. Her hair hung in limp, dark strands, her posture rigid and unnatural. I called out, my voice cracking in the silence, but she didn't move. Slowly, she turned her head, just enough for me to see the side of her face. Her eyes were black voids, empty and consuming, and then she was gone. The master bedroom was the last room I entered. The air here felt heavier, laced with a faint, metallic odor. The walls bore the faint outlines of old wallpaper, peeling in jagged strips to reveal the cracked plaster beneath. At the foot of the bed sat a trunk, pristine and out of place. Inside, I found photographs, black and white images of families who had once called this place home. Their faces were ordinary, but their eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pierce through the paper and into me. Beneath the photos lay a map of the house, and below the house was another level, marked with a single X. Next to it, one word was scrawled, basement. The door to the basement groaned as I opened it, the sound echoing down the dark, narrow staircase. Each step felt deliberate, as though the house itself dictated my pace. The air grew colder with every descent, sharp and stinging against my skin. The walls were rough stone, etched with faint carvings that seemed random at first glance. But as my flashlight swept across them, a pattern emerged. Symbols, intricate and deliberate, glowed faintly as though alive. At the far end of the room, a patch of loose dirt disrupted the otherwise smooth concrete floor. My hands clawed at the cold earth, revealing a metal door beneath. Its surface was covered in the same glowing sigils, their light pulsing faintly under my touch. The air around me seemed to hum, a low, steady vibration that resonated deep in my chest. A pedestal stood in the center of the room, and atop it rested a book. Its cover was cracked and worn, yet it seemed to pulse with energy, alive in a way that defied explanation. As I opened it, the pages turned on their own, revealing diagrams and symbols that made my head ache just to look at them. They spoke of rituals, of gateways, of forces beyond comprehension. And then I felt it. From the shadows it emerged, a figure tall and indistinct, its edges blurred like smoke. Its eyes burned red, piercing and unrelenting, locking onto me with an intensity that froze me in place. It didn't move closer, but its presence pressed against me, suffocating and inescapable. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling to cut through the darkness that seemed to close in from every side. I stumbled back, my chest tight with panic, but the figure didn't follow. It didn't need to. The house had already claimed me, its mark seared into my very being. Somehow I broke free. I don't remember climbing the stairs or bursting through the front door. I only remember the cold night air hitting my face and the sound of my own ragged breathing as I stumbled to my car. As I drove away, I felt it, a sharp, searing pain on my shoulder, like a brand being pressed into my skin. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a fleeting moment, I saw them. Two glowing red eyes stared back at me from the back seat, unblinking, unrelenting. The house had let me leave, but it hadn't let me go. I thought I could leave the house behind. That distance would blunt its grip on me. But the truth had already started to unspool, demanding my attention. The house wasn't just a cursed structure. It was a doorway, and what lay beyond was older and far more predatory than I'd imagined. I dove into the archives, starting with the earliest records of the land. Indigenous accounts described the area as a place to avoid, a cursed ground they called the mouth of the beast. Oral history spoke of a living presence beneath the soil, an entity that thrived on fear and despair. They described rituals designed to bind it, to keep it contained, but always with a warning: the seal was fragile. When settlers arrived, they ignored these warnings. The land seemed fertile, promising, and they built homes and planted crops. But their records told a different story. Families disappeared, their belongings left untouched. Neighbors reported seeing shadowy figures moving in the night, hearing voices carried on the wind. The land consumed them, one by one. In the early 1800s, a priest wrote of his visit to a farmhouse built near what is now 112 Ocean Avenue. He was summoned to bless the property after the family complained of hearing whispers at night. His letters described an overwhelming sense of dread, walls that seemed to vibrate, and an unnatural cold that drove him to flee. His final note read, "There is a mouth beneath this earth, and it feeds on the broken." Later, in the early 1900s, a tenant kept a journal during his time in a house built on the same land. The entries began mundanely, detailing the weather and the upkeep of the property. But as the days passed, his tone shifted. He wrote of shadows that moved against the light, of waking up to find objects rearranged, and of a growing dread that robbed him of sleep. His final entry was barely legible, scrawled in a trembling hand. "The mouth is hungry, and I fear it knows my name." As I pieced together these fragments, a pattern emerged. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a beacon, a focal point for something far older than the town of Amityville. The sigils I'd seen in the basement weren't there to protect the house or its inhabitants. They were there to keep what lay beneath from spreading. The more I learned, the more the haunting intensified. My nights were plagued by dreams, vivid and unrelenting. In them I stood in the basement, staring at the open metal door. The sigils on the walls glowed brighter with each dream, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. And always, the shadow figure emerged, its red eyes burning with a hatred so deep it felt personal. I would wake drenched in sweat, the dread clinging to me like a second skin. But the terror didn't end when I woke. Shadows in my apartment moved freely now, creeping across the walls and ceiling. They twisted into shapes I couldn't name, shapes that seemed to watch me. My reflection in the mirror became a stranger. At first, it was subtle, a delay in its movements, an expression that didn't match my own. But soon, it became undeniable. My reflection stared back with eyes that weren't mine, eyes filled with malice. I stopped looking in mirrors altogether. I tried to share what I'd uncovered, to warn those around me. At first, they listened. Friends, colleagues, even strangers seemed intrigued by my findings. But as the haunting grew worse, so did their reactions. Polite disbelief turned to concern, then fear. They began to avoid me, their unease palpable. Conversations ended abruptly when I entered a room. Even my dog, once my constant companion, now cowered in corners, her eyes wide with terror whenever I came near. I was alone. The isolation was suffocating, but it was more than that. I could feel the house's mark on me, a weight pressing down on my soul. My thoughts no longer felt like my own. Whispers invaded the edges of my mind, their words indistinct but relentless. They filled every silence, slithering through the cracks of my consciousness, planting doubts I couldn't shake. I began to notice changes in myself. My reflection wasn't just wrong, it was becoming me. I caught glimpses of it in windows, in the sheen of polished surfaces, and every time it seemed more solid, more present. I felt the house's presence spreading, reaching beyond its walls. People around me grew uneasy, their gazes darting to the shadows that followed me, the flickering lights that seemed to respond to my emotions. The truth was undeniable now. The house wasn't just a place, it was alive, sentient, and hungry. The land beneath it wasn't just cursed, it was predatory. The sigils in the basement weren't there to protect anyone. They were a desperate attempt to bind what lay beneath, to keep its influence contained. But the containment wasn't perfect. The entity had seeped into the house, and from the house, into me. I was no longer just a witness. I was a part of the story, a thread in the tapestry of horror that stretched back centuries. The house had claimed me, and no matter how far I ran, I knew it would let me go. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that whatever answers I sought weren't worth the risk. But the house didn't leave me a choice. Its mark wasn't just on me, it was in me. Each day the pull grew stronger, an unrelenting compulsion that consumed my thoughts. By the time I stood at the edge of its driveway again, it didn't feel like a decision. It felt like destiny. The house seemed larger now, its sagging frame leaning toward me as if in anticipation. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing against my chest with a weight that made each breath a struggle. The front door, warped and weathered, refused to budge at first, its resistance almost deliberate. When it finally gave way, the silence inside was absolute, swallowing the sound of the door creaking open. The house felt alive, aware, its oppressive stillness daring me to step further. The hallway was narrower than I remembered, the walls closing in as I moved deeper inside. Shadows clung to the corners, darker and heavier than they should have been, shifting ever so slightly as I passed. My flashlight flickered, its beam weak against the suffocating darkness. The air was colder now, sharp and biting, carrying with it the faint metallic tang I had come to associate with the house. I made my way to the basement door, its surface rough under my fingers. The sigils carved into the wood seemed to pulse faintly, their light barely perceptible but undeniably alive. The stairs creaked beneath me, each step echoing like a warning as I descended. The air grew colder with every step, the sharp chill sinking into my bones. The walls of the basement were alive with carvings, intricate patterns that seemed to shift under the weak light of my flashlight. At the center of the room, the pedestal waited, the book still resting atop it. Its cover was cracked and worn, but it pulsed with a faint energy, as though it had been waiting for me. I approached cautiously, my hands trembling as I reached for it. The pages flipped on their own, stopping at a ritual diagram that made my head ache to look at. The symbols seemed to writhe on the page, their shapes shifting just beyond comprehension. I began tracing the sigils on the walls, my fingers moving instinctively as though guided by an unseen hand. The air around me grew heavier, the oppressive silence giving way to a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the room. The sigils flared to life, their light casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The hum grew louder, rising into a cacophony of whispers, each voice layered over the next until they became an unbearable roar. And then it emerged. From the darkest corner of the room, the shadow figure stepped forward, its form no longer blurred but painfully distinct. It towered over me, its edges sharp and jagged, its eyes burning with a crimson light that pierced through the chaos. It didn't speak, but its presence was suffocating, its intent clear. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a claiming. The walls trembled, the carvings glowing brighter with each passing second. The whispers turned to screams, a deafening chorus that seemed to come from every direction. The figure moved closer, its steps deliberate and unrelenting. My flashlight flickered, its beam swallowed by the darkness that seemed to surge forward with every movement. I stumbled back, my chest tight with panic. The book fell from the pedestal, its pages scattering across the floor. The sigils on the walls pulsed violently, their light flickering as though struggling to contain the chaos they had unleashed. The ground beneath me shifted, the vibrations growing stronger, threatening to knock me off my feet. Somehow I found the strength to move. I turned and ran, my footsteps frantic against the uneven ground. The staircase seemed impossibly long, each step stretching further as though the house itself was trying to hold me back. The whispers followed me, their guttural tones growing louder, more desperate as I climbed. The hallway above was unrecognizable, its walls warped and twisted, the shadows moving freely now. The front door loomed ahead, but it felt impossibly far, the space between us stretching with every step. I threw myself at it, my hands clawing at the wood, and it finally gave way, spilling me into the cold night air. I didn't stop. My legs carried me to the car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror. But the sense of relief was short-lived. A sharp, searing pain erupted across my shoulder, like a brand being pressed into my skin. I gasped, my grip tightening on the wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there they were. Two glowing red eyes stared back at me from the back seat, unblinking, unrelenting. The house had let me leave, but it hadn't let me go. It's been weeks since I left the house, though it feels like a lifetime. Or perhaps no time at all. The days blur together now, marked not by routine or sunlight, but by the unrelenting presence that shadows my every moment. The house may be miles away, but it hasn't let me go. At first, I tried to convince myself it was over, that whatever followed me would fade with time. But the signs came quickly, undeniable in their persistence. My reflection was the first to betray me. In the beginning, it was subtle. A flicker of movement when I stood still, an expression that didn't match the emotions I felt. But now, the face staring back at me isn't mine at all. Its eyes are darker, emptier, filled with something that watches me even when I look away. The shadows are worse. They no longer cling to the corners of my apartment. They stretch and shift freely, twisting into forms I can't name. Sometimes they mimic shapes I recognize, figures from my past, faces I've lost. Other times they are entirely alien, their movements deliberate and predatory. I feel them pressing closer when I'm alone, which is always now. The isolation came quickly. At first, people listened when I tried to explain. Friends, colleagues, even strangers seemed drawn to the urgency in my voice. But their interest turned to unease, then fear. Their eyes darted to the shadows that seemed to follow me, to the flickering lights that mirrored my growing agitation. They started avoiding me, their silence louder than any words could have been. Even my dog, once my loyal companion, now hides from me, her soft whines piercing the oppressive quiet. I've stopped trying to explain. Whatever this is, it doesn't want to be understood. It feeds on the attempts, twisting my words, warping the truth until I no longer recognize it. The whispers are constant now, a low, guttural murmur that slips into every silence. They aren't words, at least not ones I can comprehend, but their meaning is clear. They aren't just around me, they are inside me. I've come to understand that the house wasn't the source of the evil. It was a vessel, a doorway for something far older, far hungrier. The sigils in the basement weren't there to protect the house or its inhabitants. They were meant to contain whatever lay beneath, to hold it back. But the containment was never perfect. The cracks have always been there, and I was foolish enough to slip through them. Now the truth is clear. The house wasn't just a place, it was a trap. A living, breathing entity that lures its prey with the promise of answers, only to consume them whole. It doesn't want to be understood, it wants to be fed. This recording is my last attempt to warn you. To anyone who hears this, stay away. Don't let curiosity lead you to that house. Don't think you can uncover its secrets without consequence. The house is patient. It waits, it watches, and once it sees you, it never looks away. Even now, as I speak these words, I can feel it watching. The air around me is heavy, the shadows shifting just beyond the edge of my vision. I glance at the screen in front of me, at the faint reflection it casts back. For a moment, I think it's just me. But then I see it. Behind me, in the reflection, the shadow figure stands, its red eyes burning through the glass. It's waiting, and it always will be.